Hello, and welcome everyone to this International Crisis Group event. My name is Pierre Prakash. I'm the Asia Program Director at Crisis Group, and I'll be moderating the discussion today, which will focus on Afghanistan and more specifically on how countries in Afghanistan's neighborhood are engaging with the Taliban regime and how these approaches differ from those of much of the rest of the world, particularly the Western world. We have a great panel lined up to discuss this. I'll introduce the panelists in a minute. But before I do, I just wanted to briefly introduce our organization. For those of you who are not familiar with International Crisis Group, we are a policy-oriented advocacy organization which focuses on conflict prevention and conflict resolution. We have a network of analysts who are based as much as possible in the field, meaning in the countries or regions that they cover. And our research methodology includes speaking to all conflict actors in order to come up with pragmatic, realistic, actionable recommendations for these conflict actors. Recommendations which are always geared towards preventing, resolving, and a lot of the time mitigating the impact on civilians of conflicts around the world. We've been working on Afghanistan for many years at Crisis Group, and we recently published a report on regional diplomacy with the Taliban regime, which explores both how countries in the region approach and interact with the Taliban, but also how what the Taliban expect from relations with their neighbors at a time when they are shunned by much of the world. The reason, and as you can see, there's a map that's actually extracted from our report here that sort of gives a bit of a snapshot of the Taliban's interaction with the rest of the world in terms of diplomatic representation, particularly. The reason we decided to do this report was because quite early on after the Taliban takeover in August 2021, we could already see signs that there were going to be divergences between the Western world and therefore a lot of the donors for Afghanistan and governments in Afghanistan's more immediate neighborhood on how to deal with the new Afghan situation. And that has played out since then, meaning that while Western powers have made improvements in women and girls' rights and a more inclusive government kind of precondition for pretty much any engagement with the Taliban beyond the provision of life-saving humanitarian aid, countries in the region have been much more pragmatic, often more by necessity than by design, in the sense that these governments have everyday issues to address with their restive neighbor, issues that range from security, particularly militancy-related issues, to regional infrastructure and connectivity, water sharing, or regional trade. And what our research has made quite evident, I think, and we'll of course be discussing this, is that none of these countries are particularly thrilled at having to deal with a somewhat unpredictable Taliban, but they have to various degrees come to the conclusion that some level of engagement, often on a piecemeal basis, serves their interest better than the isolationist policies that the rest of the world has opted for to protest the Taliban's policies, particularly, once again, those that infringe on the rights of women and girls. I'll stop here, and we'll have what should be a very interesting conversation on these issues. But I'd like to now introduce our panelists. First, we're very pleased to have with us Mr. Shivshankar Menon. Mr. Menon is a highly experienced Indian diplomat who served in various important positions over his long career, including as ambassador to China and Pakistan, as India's foreign secretary, and as India's national security advisor. Mr. Menon has also published several books on Indian foreign policy and on Asian geopolitics, and we're proud to count him as one of the members of Crisis Group's Board of Trustees. We're also very pleased to have with us Ms. Fatima Gailani. Ms. Gailani is an Afghan political leader and women's rights activist. She served as the president of the Afghan Red Crescent Society, of which she remains a board member. And she was one of the senior negotiators at the 2020 Afghan peace talks that were held in Doha, Qatar. And we are particularly pleased that she also recently joined Crisis Group's Board of Trustees. And last but not least, we have with us Ibraheem Bahiss, who is Crisis Group's analyst for Afghanistan and who is the lead author of the report I just mentioned we published recently, which will serve as a bit of a basis for the discussion today. So we have about a little less than an hour ahead of us. We'll start with a conversation among the panelists, which I'll moderate for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open the floor for a Q&A session with the audience. If you wish to ask a question, please note that you can do so at any time throughout this session, meaning you don't need to wait for the Q&A part at the end. And you can do so by typing your questions in the Q&A box. And please do mention your name and affiliation when doing so. And if relevant, of course, which panelist you wish to address your question to. And finally, before we start, please note that this event will be recorded and live streamed on Crisis Group's YouTube channel. So let's dive in. Ibraheem, I'm actually going to turn to you first. As I mentioned, you authored the recent report we published on regional diplomacy with the Taliban. This is a report that required extensive research, both in Afghanistan and abroad in various countries. And I'll just mention for those that haven't had the chance to read it yet, that the report broadly focuses on two sectors, namely security and economic cooperation. So Ibraheem, maybe to kick us off, can you please start by giving us a brief overview of the report's main finding and the recommendations that these findings have led to?
Thank you so much, Pierre, and welcome everyone who is attending this event. The report, although it was published in January of this year, was initially envisaged in late 2022. I think what kind of the main catalyst for the report was that we were already back then beginning to see some signs that the region was trying to find a new way of how to deal with its new neighborhood with the Taliban in power. While many faraway countries would have rather ignored Afghanistan, I think most regional countries continue to grapple with a plethora of issues that either emanated from Afghanistan or required coordination with Kabul as well as other regional actors. It's true that regional countries often have divergent and sometimes even contradictory imperatives and approaches to Afghanistan. But I think the common thread that seems to bind the entire region is that there is a need for dialogue and engagement with the power holders or de facto power holders in Kabul. Often you will hear regional actors justify their need for engagement using two lines of argument. Firstly, they argue that there are so many challenges and issues emanating from Afghanistan and impacting them that they have no choice but to engage with the de facto decision makers. As one regional diplomat put it to us, we can't wait for Western sentiments to shift in favor of engagement. We are here in the front lines and we need to engage now. The other line of argument that often we heard was that many regional countries argue that isolating or ostracizing the Taliban will be counterproductive and might make them even more erratic and unpredictable in the global stage. They argue that the more the Taliban is integrated into the international diplomatic architecture, the stronger will be their urge to conform to international norms, if not in the short term, then at least in the longer term. While some might question the validity of this argument, it's worth noting that as early as late 2001, Crisis Group was publishing reports where regional countries were making this exact argument, that they cannot have a failed Afghanistan and that they can never again have a policy of hands-off when it comes to the country. This experiment in engagement has been anything but smooth sailing. Initially, I think many regional countries wanted to try this, what we've termed as grand bargain approach, a strategic level engagement with Afghanistan, where they asked Kabul to make compromises in terms of the composition of the government and its policies, and the carrot that was being dangled in front of them was recognition by regional powers. I think it became very evident early on that this approach was not likely to succeed, and subsequently most regional actors have curtailed their ambitions. Now, what we see is a much more piecemeal approach where they're focusing on immediate needs of addressing security and economic needs rather than, for example, entertaining hopes of welcoming the Taliban back into the fold of the international community. The imperative for security cooperation and economic integration are quite self-evident in some ways, at least from the region's perspective. The Taliban are by far the best placed political entity to combat security threats present in Afghanistan, whether that's ISKP or other transnational groups, many of whom are allied with the Taliban and in some ways are influenced by them. While there is a great deal of skepticism regarding the Taliban's willingness and their ability to corral these groups, I think most agree that without the Taliban's active cooperation, tackling these security challenges become monumentally more difficult. On the economic front, things look equally complicated, with Afghanistan experiencing relative stability and security, perhaps unparalleled in decades. Regional appetite continues to grow in trying to connect energy-rich Central Asia with energy-demanding or energy-deprived South Asia. Regional powers are also beginning to appreciate the value of economic leverage in making the Taliban somewhat more malleable. I say this with a great deal of skepticism, but I think there is a level of appreciation that that the regional actors are beginning to try and experiment with. There is little prospect that regional countries will be rushing into Afghanistan with large-scale economic investment, but what we are seeing is some cautious experimentation in terms of seeing the limits of economic engagement. In many ways, the report tries to, or to summarize, I should say, I believe I've gone over my time, so apologies in advance. But to summarize, I think the report tries to play its small role in helping to outline some of these issues and making suggestions on how to do engagement a little bit better. It also highlights some of the impediments which hinder the capacity of regional actors, including things out of their control, such as sanctions and economic restrictions. Overall, however, I think this is an attempt to try to bridge the growing gap between regional actors and the rest of the international community in terms of how to go forward while the Taliban are still in power. Thanks.
Thank you, Ibrahim. And I think, yes, just to emphasize something that you said, I think all of these countries have actually different approaches. And it's not, there's sort of no regional trend and the idea of this grand bargain of having recognition in exchange for an inclusive government with something that actually cut across the region to some extent. I think most have given up on that, and they're now having a more piecemeal approach, as I mentioned, and somewhat transactional, which actually fits in quite well with the Taliban's way of conducting foreign policy. Ms. Gailani, I'd like to turn to you first to get your reaction to Ibrahim's comments or summary of the report, but maybe also more specifically to ask you, given your background as a women's rights activist, how you feel about the regional approach in engaging the Taliban, namely not making improvement on women and girls' rights or on an inclusive government, for that matter, a benchmark for engagement, as much of the rest of the world, once again, has been doing. And I ask this also because I actually, in preparing for this conversation, saw an interview of yours in which you mentioned that countries having embassies in Kabul is a good thing, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's basically welcome, which is not necessarily what we often hear from many in the West and elsewhere that would consider that as, that would amount to sort of undue recognition or projecting undue legitimacy on what they consider an odious regime. The floor is yours, Ms. Gailani.
Thank you very much for having me. I think it is extremely important that people who are interested in Afghanistan, whether it is the region or it is the even the Western countries, to read this wonderful report. I think it's very realistic and it opens eyes to reality of Afghanistan. In general, I am a person who is pro-engagement, and unfortunately, it is not always popular. For example, when I was encouraging engagement of the Mujahideen with and talking with the with Dr. Najibullah after the withdrawal of Soviet troops, because I knew that if we don't do such a thing, the civil war will start. And unfortunately, what I predicted was true, but I failed, although I attempted and I failed. Today, again, there are people who are very much against, whether they are the Afghans, or our international friends, but they don't understand that inside Afghanistan, it is important to listen to what the people who live inside Afghanistan, whether they are men and women, what do they want? Without engagement, how could we even think that we could come to an understanding and changing the situation? If anyone claims that, if any woman claims that the situation of women is more important for one than it is important for the other one, this will be not the right thing to think. We all women in Afghanistan, we want the situation of women to change. We want girls to go to school. We want to see women in not only as equal in working force, but also even in the political ground. I would like to women to play their role. But in order to get to that, what we are supposed to do but not get engaged? I sincerely believe that engagement is the only way. And yes, you mentioned that I was talking about the embassies, that they have presence in Afghanistan. And this is not me talking. They say that if they have once a week a meeting with the present government in Afghanistan, they have many engagements and conversations with the civil society, with women's organization, with doctors' organization, teachers, and all that. So they will have a better understanding that what is the need inside Afghanistan and what we are supposed to do. In the report, what we see is that the approach of the region, especially the approach of the neighbors toward Afghanistan, is very different from the rest of the world. But this has always been like that. There is always, and it is quite normal that they want. If I, as an Afghan, that I expect the world to put their need and their priorities before my priority, then I'm dreaming. But there are things that the whole world, they have to come to an understanding that isolating Afghanistan is a wrong thing. And Afghanistan should not be isolated. Majority of people of Afghanistan live in Afghanistan. Only few of us have left the country. Majority of women are in Afghanistan. And we need to have a very positive engagement in order to change things for Afghan people.
Thank you for those comments, Ms. Gailani, and I think very important indeed to hear you say that there is a need for engagement. You were saying that your positions aren't always very popular, and I have to say we face that at Crisis Group as well, because we've particularly been advocating for decoupling the political track from the economic track, meaning that the question of recognition of the regime shouldn't be holding up the need for economic development and development aid, probably to some extent, for the Afghan people. But if I can just follow up on this to ask you, because if I'm not mistaken, you were there was recently the high-level meeting which took place in Doha, where the UN Secretary General convened a meeting with all the special envoys for Afghanistan to try to find a way forward in how to engage with the Taliban, as was recommended by the UN Special Coordinator's report back in November. Unfortunately, no consensus seems to have emerged from those discussions, but more to my point, it seems this lack of consensus on the way forward was at least partly and due precisely to these differences of opinion between UN member states on how to go about this, and particularly between the West, to use a term I don't necessarily like, but that in the case of Afghanistan is somewhat relevant, and regional countries. Is that correct? And although you said that historically the region has had a different approach, did you sense that there is a growing divide between these two groups?
Unfortunately, yes. I think the division is getting more and more. And I think it is very dangerous, not just for Afghanistan, it is dangerous for the whole world. And we saw that when Afghanistan was isolated, it was not just Afghans who were hurt. I mean, it had affected many other countries, really very far from Afghanistan, but still it had affected them. So if we really are sincere to make Afghanistan part of the world, and the process of recognition is happening, we have to have an understanding among each other. There, sometimes even in the Western countries, when you talk to them face to face, and when it is not in an open conversation, then you see that what they want to do is different from what they are actually acting. I agree with the whole world that in order for a country, whether it is Afghanistan or any other country, which is recognized by the UN and the world, it has a procedure. And that procedure are, list of demands that it is happening. And women's issue is one of them. But engagement is different from that. I mean, even if we think that the situation will change for women in Afghanistan without engagement, I don't understand how. Those people who are against engagement, they never offered an alternative. If the alternative is starving people of Afghanistan and deprive the people of Afghanistan for this very, very meager possibilities for them to survive, if this is the way, I don't think it will work. I think that we need a proper conversation to come to an understanding. First of all, we need the world to have an understanding among themselves. For God's sake, we are all under one umbrella of the United Nations. And this is an initiative in Doha, which was taken by the UN. So all of us, we have to be in one line and understand that what is for the good of Afghanistan. I assure you, what is for the good of Afghanistan today, it will be for the good of the region tomorrow and day after tomorrow for the whole world.
Thank you. And I think that's indeed an important part of the conversation on the current situation. And Afghanistan is making that distinction between recognition and engagement, if need be, on a case-to-case basis. Mr. Menon, I'd like to turn to you for your insights. I'm, of course, curious to get your views on how India's foreign policy, specifically towards Afghanistan, has evolved over the last couple of years. But maybe first, do you have any reactions, thoughts to what Ibraheem laid out in terms of the report's findings and recommendations, and basically about the need for more regional cooperation on security and economic affairs, despite the Taliban's problematic policies?
Well, I think Ibrahim's report is really quite insightful in what it says and what it is, and in describing the situation as it is now. There is indeed quite a difference between the way the regional powers, who have interests which they cannot ignore, have reacted and have behaved over the last 2 years now, well, a year and a half. And he's right to point out that the regional powers have been much more pragmatic, but they've also been quite selective in their engagement. It's not just broad brush, engage on all fronts. You mentioned India. Short of formal recognition of the Taliban government in Afghanistan, but the diplomatic presence in both countries continues to function. Since June 2022, India's had a technical team in the embassy in Kabul. Hasn't yet reopened the old consulates, but the Afghan consulates in India, in Mumbai, in Hyderabad, and the embassy in Delhi continue to function under diplomats who now, I think, report and deal with Kabul. And humanitarian assistance has been going in. India sent in 50,000 metric tons of wheat, some earthquake relief materials, and medical aid. And so it seems to me and India is not the exception. Other countries are picking spots on that same spectrum. China maybe is the furthest along, receiving credentials. The president received the credentials of a Taliban accredited ambassador. But in practice, I think most countries have been trying to see whether they cannot evolve a working relationship, which gives us some hope of having a say or some influence in the direction of policies in Afghanistan. Now, this is a case where it seems to me that the best is the enemy of the good. We would all like a much better situation for women in Afghanistan. We would all like education to be available to all. But how do we get there if we're not even present, if we don't engage with those who have the power? So in a sense, most of the regional countries, I think, have chosen to deal with the situation as they find it and try and nudge it along in the right direction. I think the big exception, of course, is probably Pakistan, which has a unique set of problems, including having gone to the point of mass deportation of refugees. But that, I think, would be the exception to the rule and to what the picture that Ibraheem paints in his report, which is really an admirable report.
Thank you. And it's true that indeed Pakistan has, as you pointed out, a specific set of circumstances, and is probably the country in the region that's facing the most issues with the Taliban at this point in time, which was somewhat unexpected, since many thought when they came to power that actually Pakistan would be a privileged partner to the new regime in Kabul, and it's turned out quite differently. Particularly because of actions of the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP, Tehrik-e-Taliban, on Pakistani soil. But so if I'm getting you right, because I remember it being in Delhi a few years ago, just after the Doha deal, and Indian officials were frankly furious about this, saying this is projecting recognition and acceptance of a terrorist group. It will only serve, it will have a ripple effect in various parts of the world. Terrorist groups think that they can seize power by force and then get recognition. It seems that India has come a long way and has become much more pragmatic in a sense in the way it is dealing with the current regime in Taliban. Then let me mention the first time around, there was no engagement when the Taliban were in power in the late 90s, and India was actually supporting an armed opposition to the Taliban at the time. So it's really come a long way in sort of reshaping the policy towards Afghanistan.
May I make 2 quick points? One is, I'm not sure that Indian opinions of the Doha deal have changed particularly. I'm not sure that any Indian would say that was a wonderful deal and very well managed process. No, that I think stays. But I think the situation today is very different from the first time the Taliban were in power. In terms of the situation on the ground, the effective control that the Taliban actually exercise within the territory of Afghanistan, and in terms of the regional and the international, or what the Marxists would call the international correlation of forces, I think is quite different from before. So, but ultimately, I think India opts, therefore, to try and see what it can do for its own interests, but also for the Afghan people, which is where our primary links are. And you've seen, if you look at it over a slightly longer time frame, there have been so many governments in Afghanistan of various political hues. But what India has done on the ground has stayed relatively consistent in terms of medical assistance, education, for instance. Even now, this year, there are something like 3,000 scholarships given to Afghan students to study in India, and we've done another 1,000 online scholarships for Afghan students to study in Indian universities online, if given the situation now. So the things we're doing with the Afghan people, I think we'll continue to do. And we will do what we have to do with whichever regime is in power in order to make that possible, because otherwise we can't hope to influence events in a positive direction at all. On terrorism, Yes, it was I think, a huge concern, and there is skepticism about how far the Taliban is willing to implement their commitments on terrorism. But ultimately, this is counterterrorism is something that each of us has to do for ourselves, and to expect the Taliban or whoever's in power in Afghanistan to solve the problem. In India, actually, to be honest, our terrorism problem has been with Pakistan, not with Afghanistan. There haven't been Afghan terrorists in India in the last 40 years. So, so I'm not sure that that's something that has driven Indian Afghan policy for a very long time. Yes, we don't like the general idea of enabling terrorism or legitimizing it. But policy, I think you would find there's a fair amount of consistency in how India has dealt with Afghanistan.
Okay, thank you very much for those comments. Ibraheem, I'm going to turn back to you actually on this topic more or less. Some of the key concerns for most regional countries that you identified in your research revolve around security, and more specifically, the presence of foreign fighters inside Afghanistan. And there's actually widely divergent views on this internationally, both as to how much of a threat that actually represents, starting with vastly different estimates of the number of actual fighters still present on Afghan soil, but also as to how the Taliban are dealing with this situation. Can you tell us a bit about the current situation in the country, security situation, including which are the groups that are perceived as security threats, and whether the Taliban are doing anything to rein them in? And I just remind our audience that that's something they had committed to as part of the Doha Deal a few years ago.
Thank you. I think security often features at the very top of the list of priorities when you are speaking with regional diplomats. As one analyst put it to us, security is the start and end of every conversation on Afghanistan within the region. I think one, the Taliban's history, but also, as you pointed out, the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty around the security picture, the security dynamics inside the country, which groups are operating inside Afghanistan, what are their relationships with the Taliban, how is the Taliban managing and dealing and controlling and reining in these groups. I think there's a great deal of uncertainty which also feeds into this regional concern around security. The Taliban's novel approach to controlling these Islamist groups, particularly those allied with it, is also another big factor. Before returning to that, let me just say, perhaps we can divide the security concerns into two major groupings. One is the groups that the Taliban is actively combating. And within those, the big concern for most regional countries, I would say, is Islamic State's local chapter, known as Islamic State Khorasan or Islamic State Khorasan province. The Taliban have been actively fighting this group since 2020 and even before then. So there's a long history of kind of tensions between the Taliban and this group. In some ways, I think the Taliban have shown a level of success against ISKP in the sense that they have managed to kill senior members of ISKP. ISKP's hopes of, expanding beyond Afghanistan and carrying out big attacks, while it has had some success, it has been relatively limited. At the same time, I think it's worth noting that ISKP has evolved into a more regional threat compared to before the Taliban's takeover. And part of that's simply the fact that ISKP is understanding that it sensed an opportunity that there is recruits within Central Asia that it can tag onto. So ISKP has managed to expand its network outside Afghanistan. But within Afghanistan, it has faced quite a lot of difficulties. And I think in many ways, at least the last year, 2023, was a year its abilities were stunted quite significantly. That's one grouping of security concerns. The other one is major grouping is the groups that are allied with the Taliban, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's the TTP, or some of the other groups. I think that's where some of the countries also have significant concerns about what the Taliban are doing on that front. Often you will hear contradictory analyses on this issue. Some would argue, for example, let's turn to the UN's sanction monitoring team's latest report on Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. Even within that, you kind of could sense that it was narrating this almost two parallel narratives. On the one hand, it was saying that the Taliban is taking actions to contain Al-Qaeda and other groups, and that this is creating tensions in the relationship between the two. But then in the same breath, it was almost saying that the Taliban continues to support that their relationships, historical relationships, remain strong. And some suggest that even that the Taliban is assisting some of these groups in terms of thriving. And one of the statements that kind of stood out for me, at least, was this claim that Al-Qaeda is built 6 or 7 or 8 training camps and madrasas, and even has a weapon depot. So I think that kind of was illustrative in some sense of the fact that there's very little facts that the region agrees on, or at least we agree on the facts, but how to analyze them and interpret them sometimes engenders different kind of results. And that's why there is, I think that's a big cause of why regional countries continue to see Afghanistan's security situation with a level of anxiety. And just, sorry, I've rambled on for long enough, but just to kind of bring it back, I think Crisis Group, again, attempts to offer some kind of recommendations in how we can try to make the situation better. And two of the recommendations, perhaps worth noting, one is that we need better factual statements, and that requires the UN sanctions monitoring team to be going into the country, speaking with all sides, including the Taliban, to ascertain a more accurate picture so that we can build analysis on facts that are more agreeable to all sides. And the second recommendation we've made is that we need to tone down the rhetoric. Oftentimes, escalating rhetoric, and this is I think, sort of a habit within the Taliban, but at times, unfortunately, some regional countries have reciprocated it. This escalating rhetoric kind of it engenders distrust and creates more complications. So we've recommended that we need to tone down the rhetoric and focus more on the accuracies of statements rather than allowing assumptions or paranoia to take hold in this field. I'm going to stop there just because I think I've gone way over my assigned time. Thanks.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Ibraheem, for that. I see time is running, and I do want to keep time for the Q&A session, but I also like to touch upon the economic aspects that are covered in this report. As you, I think, said earlier, there's sort of an overwhelming logic for better economic and infrastructure integration in the region. We at Crisis Group have consistently argued that Taliban, or told Taliban, the international community needs to nurture economic prosperity in Afghanistan for the sake of the Afghan people, but also for regional stability. And this also relies on international funding, particularly from international financial institutions, where decision-making power, is mostly in the hands of Western powers via their voting rights. And we've recently witnessed some welcome movement on this front with the World Bank's latest decision to support some basic services inside Afghanistan. Ibraheem, quickly, can you walk us through some of the main economic issues that you raised in this report, and whether these recent developments and this sort of, I wouldn't say support from Western countries, but at least quiet acquiescence in terms of allowing this funding to go through will help and addresses those concerns? And more generally, is it realistic given regional tensions with some of the countries involved?
So I think on the economic front, as you pointed out, the imperative is really quite self-evident that the region, in some ways, Afghanistan has been a barrier that has prevented regional prosperity and interconnectivity, and so it's in that sense quite evident that Afghanistan needs to be somehow integrated into the economic architecture. And previous Afghan governments and the Taliban have all attempted to try to portray Afghanistan's capacity as a bridge between these different regions. But as you rightly pointed out, there are a number of factors that have continued to inhibit this, despite the better security, in a sense. Tensions within, for example, security tensions emanating, for example, from the TTP have become a key barrier to projects that are envisaged to connect Central Asia with South Asia. The other issue which I see has been raised in the Q&A was water tensions. There is a lot of regional tension around Afghanistan when it comes to water management, which is creating a kind of a level of an atmosphere of uncertainty. In our report, I think we've kind of touched upon this water issue as one, although technically speaking, you could say that's not an economic issue, but because it kind of inhibits economic activity in a sense. And the other big issue or assumption that's often thrown out there is that regional actors are rushing into Afghanistan to fill the void that has been left after the withdrawal of the US from the country. I think we've really tried to bust that myth in a sense and kind of show that the difficulties and around economic engagement in Afghanistan and explaining and rationalizing why the regional countries are not really rushing in the sense. And again, a big contributor, as you pointed out, to that is economic sanctions and the fact that in some ways the international community, the rest of the international community, holds the levers on how much economic activity and interaction can happen with Afghanistan. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ibrahim. We're starting to get questions, and I'd like to turn to those because it allows to cover actually more ground as well in terms of topics. Once again, if you have questions to the panel in general or to a particular panelist, please do type them in the Zoom Q&A in front of you, mentioning your name and affiliation if possible. First of all, thanks to our three speakers for their insights so far, and I will now start diving into the questions that we've been receiving from the audience. And I'm going to take this first question for Ms. Gailani. This is from somebody called Rana Azimi. As an Afghan woman, what are your suggestions for Afghan women's meaningful participation in the regional and international engagement process with the Taliban? How can we ensure that women's voices are heard and their contributions recognized in these discussions? Ms. Gailani?
Yes, this is a very important question, and this is a way forward for women in Afghanistan. We have to encourage voices as much as the voices in diaspora and outside Afghanistan is important, but the voice of women in Afghanistan, inside Afghanistan, is much more important. And in order to give them a voice, if you don't have presence, how could you hear those voices? I mean, if you don't have engagement inside Afghanistan, how could you even claim that not just women, but the minorities in Afghanistan and also the people who are actually caught between the two, either the policies from outside and the policies from inside, and their voice is not heard properly. Without engagement, how could you encourage or give microphone to those voices? That's why I think in the international conferences, women should be invited from inside Afghanistan. And also the presence of not just those few countries that they have presence in Afghanistan, but other countries also should start a way to have a conversation and understand the needs of the women in Afghanistan.
Thank you. Okay, I'm looking at other questions. I'm going to turn to, 1 second, I'm shuffling the questions. I'm going to turn to Mr. Shivshankar Menon. We have, as I know you are an old China hand, so to say, we have a question from Mr. Mark Brisky, Murdoch University, Australia, which is a very wide question on the role of China and its recent apparent engagement in Afghanistan. And I think you mentioned in your initial comments how China was, in a sense, furthest ahead in terms of engagement with Afghanistan. Can you elaborate a little more on that aspect of things and how you think China perceives the current Afghanistan situation?
Well, you know, only the Chinese can speak for China, but the way I see it, China has consistently engaged with the Taliban, both the first time they were in power, but even in between. And even before they came to power the first time, I remember I have Chinese diplomatic friends who I think are the only people I've shaken hands with who shook hands with who met Mullah Omar. They've engaged, and I assume this is because of the situation in Xinjiang and their worries about the support in Afghanistan to what they regard as separatist elements, the East Turkestan movement. But also, I think there has always been the sense that in China's periphery, China needs to deal with all the relevant actors. And there's been the economic draw. In the last year alone, China has signed several contracts for mainly extractive industries in Afghanistan. None of them have actually started on the ground, but the intent is clear, and it does provide some reassurance, I think, to the rulers in Kabul today that China has an interest and an abiding interest. And of course, the most visible symbol of this Chinese engagement has been the acceptance of the credentials of the Taliban ambassador by President Xi Jinping in January this year. So on most of the vectors, whether it's economic, whether it's security, whether it's consistency of policy, I think and recognition, diplomatic recognition, I think you'll see a fair consistency in Chinese behavior of engaging with whoever's in power on their immediate periphery. But I do believe that so far, at least, it is, and increasingly also, I think, as the relationship between the Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan has deteriorated, I think the Chinese have come to the conclusion that it's time they got involved directly in this and stopped relying on Pakistan to help them with this relationship or to manage this situation. And so I think that's partly one explanation for the increased Chinese activism that we see.
All right, thank you. And it's true. I mean, it's worth pointing out. Actually, the report, for those that are interested, goes into how Chinese investors initially came to Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover, and that didn't actually go too well. We're talking more about, people looking for the sort of small-time investors, in a sense, looking for the new frontier rather than serious investment, and that didn't really pan out too well with the Taliban. But now there has been actually contracts with government companies. But as you point out, extraction, a lot of this has to do with extraction industries, extractive industries, and actually the extraction per se hasn't started. So whether it's sort of a diplomatic tool to ensure good relations with the neighborhood, or whether it's also an investment in the future, just mentioned that Afghanistan's natural resources haven't actually been properly mapped, but everybody expects that there's quite a few useful resources underground. So it could also be investment for the future on China's part. I have a question on civil society in Afghanistan, which I can direct to either Ms. Gailani or Ibrahim, whoever feels best placed to take it. And the question is from Ms. Lena Lindberg, former UNDP director in Pakistan up to 2004 and engaged with the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan more recently. The question is, which are the strongest CSO, civil society organizations, able to exist and operate in today's conditions in Afghanistan? Ms. Gailani or Ibrahim, I don't know which of you feels wants to take the floor on this.
I think we both can say it. Mine will be very short. For me,
Please.
the real civil society of Afghanistan will always remain in Afghanistan. And this is the imam of the mosque. It is the teachers, male and female. It is Wakil Guzar, it is me, the representative of the area. These are the people that they'll not specifically have an office and a placard on their offices, but they have been with the people and they have been representing people. I remember during King Zahir Shah, they didn't have the name of civil society, but they will say the representative of people. Numayende Mardumi. They were, I remember it, they were teachers, male and female, doctors of that area, imam of the mosque, and also if Malik or Khan existed there. They will be always there. But then we started having a civil society with a placard on their office, which was heavily, invested on by the outside countries. And now most of them left the country, but the ones which exist in the country, they are doing a fantastic job. And this is, it means that they have connected with the people. They have become the part of the society. So we have to engage with them.
Thank you. Ibrahim, do you want to add anything?
Sure, briefly, and before I turn to that, on the question before in terms of China's involvement, in November last year, I went to a really remote part of Afghanistan between Kandahar and Uruzgan province, between Shawalikot, around the mountains there. And the locals told me, we were going there to look for ephedra for one of our upcoming narcotics reports, by the way, but I saw a small camp out in at the top of the mountain, and the locals told me those were Chinese investors who had come in and they were involved in some kind of extraction of stones in the area. So we're beginning to now see, it was a very small scale operation, but to see Chinese investors in the south of Afghanistan was quite a novelty in a sense, and perhaps symbolizes kind of the haphazard way that economic engagement has happened. And briefly, to return to the main question, I think Ms. Gailani has excellently summarized it. I don't need to add anything, just briefly that, where political objectives, where civil society and even political actors who are taking forward political objectives, that's where the Taliban have been the strictest, and where I think it has nurtured economic activity or benefit that the Taliban perceive as benefit to their longevity and staying power, is often where you would see encouragement from their authorities. Civil societies who have been involved in the education sector, in the education of in female girls' schooling and whatnot, I think those have really bore the brunt in terms of restrictions, whereas conversely, one of the areas where we have seen a lot of encouragement from the Taliban has been in the sector of female involvement in trades and crafts, in terms of nurturing kind of female-led crafts in the area. Thanks.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I'm going to turn back to Mr. Menon, but others feel free to comment as well. Actually, Ibrahim, you might have things to contribute in this. Question is addressed to Mr. Menon from Franziska Marfoot from the Swiss Refugee Council. Could you elaborate a little bit on how Pakistan's and also Iran's deportation of Afghan citizens affects the relations between these countries? And do you know what the situation of the deported Afghan in Afghanistan looks like that large part maybe more for Ibraheem, actually. Mr. Menon, thoughts on Afghanistan, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan relations. Of course, just to remind the audience, Pakistan has launched a mass deportation of Afghan illegal migrants, as they call them. We're talking millions of people that are being sent back across the border to a country which, of course, is in the midst of a major humanitarian and economic crisis. Just for background regarding that question, Mr. Menon, any insights on on how this deportation is affecting the relations between the countries? Oh, Mr. Menon, I think you're on mute. Sorry.
I have no real insights into this, and I'll leave the second question to Ibraheem to answer about the actual situation on the ground. But for me, the sad thing is that the relations between these three countries, between Afghanistan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan too, are actually today worse than they were some years ago. And there have been armed clashes across all these borders. And the main casualty is obviously the humanitarian situation, ability to problem of for Pakistan to actually deport such large numbers of people, to call them illegal when many of them have been there for a long time, have some sort of status. Some of them have Afghan citizenship certificates, some don't. It really hasn't helped anyone's ability to deal with the real problem, which, as you said, is the humanitarian crisis that already exists. It really is a tragedy. So I'm not sure that this is a problem that is amenable to the sort of state solutions that we're used to in other contexts. This ultimately it's going to have to be solved by the societies themselves, and that's the level at which actually people are being taken care of. There's very little state involvement except in helping the problem, but the states are not in a position, I think, to actually solve the humanitarian crisis at all. So it's really the strength of Afghan society and the ability of Pakistan society to respond to this. There have been very strong voices in Pakistan saying the deportations don't make sense. But fortunately, I think the state of Pakistan politics, to the elections, I don't see easy state-to-state solutions emerging in the near future.
Indeed, and I would add, I mean, particularly Pakistan, Afghanistan situation seems to be really deteriorating. We can wait to see what happens post-Pakistan elections, but I don't think we should be holding our breath for sort of a major turnaround in the trend that we've been witnessing in the last couple of years. Ibraheem, I'm going to turn back to you, and I think you actually mentioned this question in passing earlier, but it's a question from Ms. Vanessa Cardamon, climate analysis expert at ACAPS. How do we expect the Taliban to deal with water scarcity and potential tensions around water with its neighboring countries? And this is something you address to some extent, particularly the disputes around water with Iran and Uzbekistan in the report. Any insights on both addressing those tensions and also the climate change aspect of things, the water scarcity, which is getting worse with climate change?
So on the previous, in terms of the repatriation, I just want to add a couple of points that although we've seen a large-scale repatriation both by Iran and Pakistan since late last year, I think in many ways they're symbiotic of two very different concerns. Iran has become the hub for a lot of Afghans who are trying to immigrate, leave the country and go onwards in most scenarios towards Europe. And Iran has become a kind of a launching pad. And many Afghans who are seeking economic betterment for their families, Iran has become a natural choice to go and do labor to earn extra money. And with Iran struggling with its own economic challenges, as well as growing anti-Afghan sentiment. That's been kind of the driver behind Iran's decision to repatriate a lot of these Afghans. And I think in many ways, the Taliban have given quite acquiescence to this repatriation, because the Taliban have also publicly come out and kind of oppose Afghans leaving the country, especially in the initial months when they took power, because it kind of they saw this as painting them in a bad light. When it comes to Pakistan, it's Mr. Menon's already highlighted this, but Pakistan's been trying to use different ways to influence the Taliban's behavior, particularly vis-a-vis the TTP. And I think this was one of those desperate attempts, one of the more radical in some ways, because many of these who were repatriated, some of them were born in Pakistan, some of them have spent their entire lives in Pakistan. They know Pakistan better than they knew Afghanistan. So in that sense, I say it was a very radical and in some ways a desperate decision to try to pressure the Taliban into kind of responding more to some of the Islamabad's demands. On the second part of the question, I think there has been generally speaking, there has been good cooperation between the Taliban and international NGOs in managing some of those returnees. But unfortunately, Afghanistan's economic situation still is very stifling, and that just increases incentive even for the returnees to try to attempt to go back and seek better future somewhere else. Returning to the water issue, let me briefly say that water is one of those issues that gained prominence during former President Ashraf Ghani's tenure. He made water a key hallmark of his foreign policy. And I think the Taliban kind of learned and picked up from that the Taliban, when they first came to power, were in desperate need of trying to build up their nationalistic credentials. And this water became one of those issues where they could rally Afghans behind them. Not just the Taliban, but most Afghans you speak with would argue that Afghanistan is really rich in terms of its water resources, but unfortunately, due to 4 decades of war, it hasn't really been able to capitalize on that resource, and would argue that much of the region has benefited from these resources. And now it's Afghanistan's turn to catch up and try to utilize this. So that until we can, that makes, as an Afghan, I completely sympathize with that argument and it makes sense to me, but I think it's the wrong way to go about it, because already an infrastructure is built and it's just adding, in a time when we're facing dire climate change issues, it's adding a very unnecessary burden to the whole ecosystem. But it's worth pointing out a couple of things in terms of solutions to this issue. One is that let's turn to the Helmand River, where we've seen tensions between Iran and Afghanistan. One of the positive issues I observed was the Taliban accepted the treaty that exists between Iran and Afghanistan. And this is a treaty that was never ratified. So even from an international law perspective, its status is a bit more tenuous, but both Iran and Afghanistan have continued to, and the Taliban, I should say, have continued to refer to this treaty and use it as a reference point in trying to educate their tensions and differences. So I think in some ways that's positive news, in the sense that the Taliban are willing to accept international frameworks when it comes to managing some of these tensions. And very lastly, the other thing is that a lot of the regional countries want Afghanistan to utilize these resources, but want them to do it in a more efficient way. Unfortunately, most of these regional countries themselves don't have the expertise or the financial resources to be able to help Afghanistan and manage this. So I think that's where the need for international involvement, including involvement by international organizations, becomes quite important. And it's one of the areas, again, I'll refer you to our report where we've covered this in more detail, but basically one of the areas where we have identified common ground for international Western countries, international organizations, regional actors, and Afghanistan to come together and try to prevent a sort of slow rolling catastrophe in terms of the impact it will have on the economic, regional climate and ecosystem. Thanks.
Absolutely. And just to point out, I mean, we at Crisis Group actually published a piece at the time of COP28 a few months ago, arguing that the Taliban should be invited to the COP28, which was, of course, a very controversial topic, because that could also equate to recognition. But Afghanistan is the 6th or 7th most affected country by climate change worldwide. 80% of its water resources depend on disappearing glaciers, and they're arguably suffering, more and more droughts. There are various impacts of climate change in Afghanistan, and having the country just not part of that conversation, there is something wrong. And so we hit again on that distinction between recognition and necessary engagement to an extent on the climate change issue as well. I will have a question maybe from Ms. Gailani. Question coming from Ms. Sarah Hyungen. Have regional countries been able to negotiate any advancements towards what the West requires, meaning related to women's rights and I would add inclusivity, that could be shared, and that could sort of be a promising outcome of their approach to pragmatic diplomacy? In other words, have they been able to make any headway on the issues related to women and girls by being more pragmatic and some would argue less principled in their approach with the Taliban?
Well, actually, Indonesia was the only country which has really started helping Afghanistan and have a conversation inside Afghanistan. The foreign minister of Indonesia, being a woman, tried very hard to start see it from an Islamic point of view, to be sort of a link between the Western countries and the Taliban. But I didn't see any result yet. But a very unfortunate situation like the returnees from Pakistan and Iran, and the unfortunate earthquake in Herat opened the eyes of the present government in Afghanistan, the importance of women be present there. For example, all female doctors were called to come to attend to either returnees or in the earthquake area, and the same thing with the women social workers. And then these women were not sent back home, so they are still working. And also, the situation came in as such that in these medical fields, girls are allowed to finish school in order to go to these medical fields. So the door is not completely closed. And I think this sort of conversation could help. But as we said it from the very beginning, that the key is really having a positive engagement and understanding. And without that, and without presence, it is impossible to see these things. And it is impossible to carry on a mission that one has started. So women's education should not be a political bargaining chip. It has a necessity inside the country. It is nothing against it, either in our religion or in our tradition. It was more than 68 years ago that we had women ministers. So it cannot be that. We have to find a way for that. And finding the way is only can be through a proper engagement. And this is one issue that I really beg the region and also the whole international community, that for God's sake, at least in this thing, we have to be on one page. We cannot be scattered and ask for things which is impossible.
Thank you, Ms. Gailani. I see that time is running. We're actually over time, so I realize that we could actually continue so many things we can touch upon in this conversation, but I will bring it to a close. I imagine people have also other plans. I want to thank once again our panelists for what I thought was a very interesting conversation, drawing on your various backgrounds. I thought was quite complimentary. Thank you once again for participating in this panel, and thank you for all the guests. And I know we had guests from various parts of the world attending this call. And apologies to those whose questions I was not able to relate to the panelists. We had a lot of questions. I had to be a little selective there. I also want to remind you that the event was recorded. You can look it up on our website, crisisgroup.org, or if you feel it's relevant for colleagues or others you want to pass on the link to. Thank you once again for your participation in this event, and we look forward to seeing you soon for other crisis group conversations on Afghanistan and other conflicts. Thank you.
Thank you.